Hi there, and I want to welcome everybody to the Research Data Management Call to webinar. My name is Laura Lamar, and I'm the Program Operations Manager here at Canary. And in this webinar, we will have two portions. The first portion is going to be done by Mark Leggett, who will take care of all the technical program questions. And the second portion will be Patrick Dang, and he will be taking care of all the finance questions. What will happen is we will do the first portion. Mark will walk us through all of his slides, and at the end of Mark's slides, he will answer any of the technical questions at that time. Then Pat will be handling all of his financial slides, so he will walk through all of his slides, and he'll handle all the finance questions at the end of his slides. So with that, I'm going to introduce Mark. You can take it over, Mark.
Okay, thanks, Laura. And just as an encouragement, if you do have questions, feel free to type them in anytime. You don't have to wait till my slides are done. And the preference would be if you use the Q&A icon and window to type in your question. That makes it easier for us to queue them up and indicate when they're answered. The chat window is also there, but just makes it easier for us if you use Q&A. All right, next slide. The current state of the Canadian research data management ecosystem, although it's evolving and becoming more nationally focused and interoperable, to a large degree, we have a set of disparate systems or silos that operate in typically in isolation, whether it's a data repository or a particular, let's say it's a DOI minting service that's integrated into a particular software platform. Some of these systems accommodate or adhere to international standards and protocols. It's not the most common thing to see with our research software infrastructure. And then we have quite a variety of different research platforms and tools that all work in different ways with our national network compute and storage services. So it's a little bit of a discombobulated system, if you will. And this is part of the reason why Canary has started with the Research Data Management Program with a previous Call 1 and now Call 2. So the goal of, you were bang on with that slide switch. There we go. So in not just with the new developments, because of course, whether you're in a particular discipline or you're in a general research data management context, there's more and more attention being paid to international standards and best practices. And the Canary's goal with the first RDM call and now the second one, which is the focus of today's webinar, is to encourage more of that adoption of best practices and standards, and especially what are called the FAIR principles: findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. But the real focus of the current Call 2 is that interoperability wheel in the middle. So we have a great deal of interest in facilitating some of the current efforts, but really trying to encourage additional efforts in increasing interoperability between the different research platforms, software services, and systems that are out there. And as I'll mention shortly, it also has a focus on what we call functional layers. So our goal is to increase interoperability. That's kind of the key word for this call. Next slide. So just to go back to Call 1, which successful projects were funded last year. That funding will result in up to $3.2 million being allocated to 9 research data management focused projects. And the focus of that initial call was to support researchers in their ability to find, access, and reuse data, enable the adoption of best practices, and align with national and international standards. So there was a real focus in that first call on funding that would help software infrastructure adhere to a greater degree to the FAIR principles in particular, but international best practices in general. And that access to that infrastructure would facilitate Canadian researchers' ability to adopt best practices in research data management. And there are various interests at stake here, aside from just the simple making it easier for researchers to do to engage in research more effectively and more efficiently, save them time. There's also the desire to help the researchers respond to the increasing mandates and policies that we see, especially in the funding agency context, as well as increasingly publishers, academic publishers, that are starting to mandate or insist on the provision of data that accompanies research articles or adopting open access or fair approaches to research. So there's a number of factors that affect this. So these calls are in response to those. Next slide. So those 9 projects will wind up at the end of March next year. So they're, say, just a little more than halfway into their development cycles. RDM Call 2 builds on that initial call, not in terms of those existing funded projects, but in general, by focusing, as I mentioned, on that enhancing interoperability of the components. So this call will provide up to 2 million to projects with a maximum of 700,000 for each submission. And again, the focus is on enhancing interoperability of platforms, repositories, and services, and how that enhances their ability to participate in a national data services framework. So you can imagine that that interoperability piece can happen at different layers, as I mentioned previously. The focus in terms of interoperability also suggests that projects that involve multi-institutional or multi-platform or multi-system collaborations would be ideal, and especially if they represent currently non-interoperable systems, and that those are made more interoperable through these various functional layers, and therefore just making it easier for researchers in any discipline across Canada to take advantage of these services. Next slide. So the functional layers can be thought of in many parts of research software infrastructure. The 7 that are mentioned here are common examples because of the impact they do have on the researcher's ability to find data, because it's more discoverable. It has enhanced metadata that increases the discovery system's ability to make it accessible. It ties different outputs in the research lifecycle together, whether it's an actual data set, a journal article, a funding application, additional resources or outputs from that researcher. And the ability to tie those things together typically comes through the use of persistent IDs. There's also this concept of FAIR service registries, or a self-identifying piece of software infrastructure that kind of meets best practices in describing what it does, how it does it, and how other software systems or people interested in integrating with that system can do that. Best practices in terms of metadata deposit and harvest. The meta in parentheses followed by data just simply is a way to refer to both the deposit and harvest of metadata itself as well as the associated data. So increasingly that harvest and deposit is critical for researchers. Simplifying identity management so that researchers can take advantage of the functionality of disparate systems without having to have different usernames, passwords. Identity management also facilitates a more secure identification of people accessing the system and also facilitates better security. Storage is always a challenge, whether it's trying to facilitate effective local, regional, or national storage. So one can think of all 7 of those functional layers as critical parts of a cohesive, functional, national research data management ecosystem. But there are also numerous others, hence the 8th category there. So we're not trying to restrict proposals to working with those first 7 functional layers. Those are just some of the critical ones that would be common to many. But there are other ones like provenance, curation, security, data analysis that form an equally critical part of these kinds of software infrastructures. Next slide. And as I mentioned, and as with the RDM Call 1, Call 2 also highlights the importance of proposed infrastructure development efforts fitting into the larger national data services framework. And we define an NDS in this context, or a national data service, as one that provides one or more data-related functions to stakeholders like researchers, but also others, across any discipline and in a national context. So a national data service could be something that functions within a specific discipline, or one that functions across any research discipline. So that is aside from the interoperability via the functional layers, adherence or intersections with the National Data Services Framework and support for the FAIR principles remain important elements in this Call 2, as well as in the previous Call 1. Next slide. So same diagram as before, but just to reiterate, as you can imagine, this is a highly simplified version of a National Data Services Framework, and that's deliberate partly to not to highlight or propose or recommend or support any particular standard or protocol or technology, but also to try and, again, indicate that there, with the broad interest in interoperability and best practices and adhering to the FAIR principles, there's a great deal of flexibility that can be seen when one tries to lay your own research software infrastructure ideas into this ecosystem, into this national data services framework. So this is intended to, again, facilitate the conversation locally about the kinds of ideas that might be good submissions to this funding call. Next slide. So in all of this, there are probably a number of questions that you would be asking, and there are certainly common questions that we tend to get or that emerge through both Call 1 and as Call 2 goes forward. So I'll just go through each of these, and then I'll highlight the timeline for this call, and then consider any questions you might have. So if you do have questions that are coming up, then as I said, feel free to type them into the Q&A anytime. So in this call, can funding be used to develop new software components and tools from scratch? So while the goal of the call is to enhance existing software in that interoperability context, we realize that sometimes in order to affect that greater interoperability, some new software components will have to be developed. But the intention of the funding is not, it's definitely not focused on the creation of new platforms from scratch, but components that make existing platforms interoperate in a better context and at different functional layers. Does existing software that is leveraged have to be originally funded by Canary? And the simple answer is no. Any software that participates in that research data management ecosystem is appropriate to be considered in a proposal for this call. Next slide. Is there any focus on a specific type of research data? And again, the answer is no. We're interested in proposals that support researchers in any discipline, and also potentially support all researchers regardless of discipline. Next question, can funded participants in the previous call 1 for RDM benefit from funding available under this call? And the answer is yes. But obviously proposals need to address the interest in the FAIR principles and multi-system interoperability at that national or international level. So that's a key consideration. Next question, are there examples of existing national data services? There are certainly numerous examples in the domain-specific context with platforms that facilitate the work that researchers do in very specific disciplines. And there are also examples in a more generic context. There's a couple here, such as the Portage DMP Assistant and the Federated Research Data Repository, the Scholars Portal Dataverse, or the other institutionally affiliated Dataverse systems, all kind of function in that more generic context. And finally, the Hub Zero platform, which Canary has worked with a couple of organizations to implement to support the research lifecycle. And as I said, there are many domain-specific platforms. The key interest, of course, is that it functions at that national level across one or more functional areas. Next slide. Does the developed software have to support all 4 FAIR principles? No. There are certainly specific examples, whether it's the use and integration of PIDs into a framework that in itself developers may see as supporting a particular aspect of one of the 4 FAIR principles, but often software components that are developed do generally intersect with more than one of the FAIR principles. In fact, it sometimes can be a challenge to determine which of the 4 FAIR principles particular software functionality that you may be developing intersects with. So the simple answer is no, it doesn't have to support all 4. But having said that, the level of support for the FAIR principles is part of the scoring criteria for the peer review process. In a similar way, does the developed software have to support all the listed functional layers? And as you can gather from the nature of my earlier comments, the answer is no. The focus is again on interoperability of multiple existing platforms, repositories, and services at one or more of those functional layers. And again, like support for the FAIR principles, support for functional layers is part of the scoring criteria. And that obviously scoring could reflect a strong proposal that is working with one functional layer or multiple functional layers. So the number, it's not so much the number of functional layers that are part of the proposal, but the quality of the enhancements to existing software and the improvement in interoperability. Next slide. Does the software developed with funding need to be accessible to all researchers regardless of discipline or organizational type? No. The software would need to be accessible to all Canadian researchers in a particular discipline or to any Canadian researcher. And ideally, regardless of institution, as long as they're publicly funded researchers. So this is the national part. Gets at that national part of the National Data Services Framework, that it should be accessible to any researcher in a particular discipline or any discipline. Can applicants partner with international organizations? Absolutely. That can bring benefits to a proposal, but project PIs themselves must be from a Canadian institution, and the funds that are given out must be spent on resources based in Canada. So international partners can be brought in and participate with their own resources. But generally speaking, the funds must flow within the Canadian context. Next slide. Is there a requirement for integrating a specific number of systems? And again, the answer is no. Comes back again to this statement I made about the quality of the proposed development efforts and the impact on the national services to researchers and that issue of interoperability. And like the other two that I mentioned, the integration and the number of separate systems that are part of the proposal also forms part of the scoring in the peer review process. Next slide. So those are a few of the questions that we've kind of anticipated. And there's a couple of questions that are starting to come into the Q&A, so I'll come to those in a minute. But just to reiterate the timeline, so the call was launched on September 5th. Submissions are due at the end of October, on October 29th. And I would particularly highlight that if you're considering a proposal, pay attention to the time of day that submissions are allowed in on that October 29th date, because it's not midnight. It's earlier in the day, and the system will be inaccessible once that time is passed. So you want to pay attention not just to the date, but also the time of day. Once those proposals are in, then the Canary team does their work and packages the submissions to be considered by a review committee of peers. And that evaluation happens in the November-December timeline. And once those recommendations are approved, then notifications are sent to the both the unsuccessful applicants as well as the successful applicants. And then during January, March, the intention is to finalize all the agreements and contracts so that funds can start to flow on April 1st, 2020. And these are 2-year projects. So there's a total of 24 months in which the development efforts can happen, starting April 1st next year and ending on March 31st, 2022. Like all of Canary's software infrastructure funded projects, including research software and research data management, the successful teams meet with one or more people from the Canary team every 6 weeks to get a sense of progress and any roadblocks or anything in particular that Canary might be able to do to facilitate or answer questions. And like this past January, where we had an RDM workshop with the 9 successful projects, the goal is to have 1 and possibly 2 similar workshops over that 2-year timeline for the projects that are funded in this new Call 2. There's also a possibility of bringing the projects funded in Call 1 together with people from Call 2, but there are some that's yet to be determined and finalized. And our goal typically is to have that workshop at the same time as the National Data Services Framework Summit. So that's the timeline. So maybe I'll just pause there. And Laura, did you want to field the questions or? I can do that too. Yeah, I'm not getting audio on your side, so.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, perfect. So we have 2 questions. And right now it says, actually, a third one just came in. The first one is there a preference of national data services interoperability over those that would contribute more directly to international interoperability efforts in a domain?
I don't think so. I think the implication behind robust international interoperability is that it is inclusive of the national context in Canada. So there's no preference for what I call generic versus discipline-specific submissions. and no preference as to whether that interoperability is more specifically framed within the national or international context. Like I say, I think international subsumes the national piece.
Okay, we've got another question. We are multi-institutional, but the other institutes are international. Can we count international partner contributions to meet the in-kind requirements for the project?
You know, I'm probably going to have to pass that. And I don't know if Patrick would want to weigh in now or wait until we get to the finance questions.
We'll just wait till we get to the finance questions, and I'll leave this one here so that we make sure we address it. So then the third one was, in multi-institutional efforts, how would, you know what, this actually looks like it possibly is a finance question too. In multi-institutional efforts, how would funds be managed within a project? So we'll direct that as well to.
Yeah, I think Patrick will come to that one, yeah.
Okay.
And if there are other questions that come up in terms of the nature of the proposals, in terms of these, what we call the technical aspects of the call, then you can continue to put your questions in the Q&A, and if they're appropriate, I'll respond to them in time. So I'll pass that over then, Laura.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mark. I just wanted to note that if anyone has any French questions, they can send them to programs@canary.ca. Due to this just being an English webinar today. With that, we'll pass it on to Pat.
Thank you, Laura. Before I start, I'll let you guys know I'm joining here with Tracy Murray. She is our Director of Finance. And both of us will be happy to answer any questions you might have at the very end. So here, I'll go over some commonly asked questions from the finance side of things, and I'll provide some responses to those questions. So the first section we have here is preparing the budget. Is there anything that you need to know or consider before completing the budget? So all the project costs must align with the schedule of eligible costs. On the bottom of this slide, we'll have a link to access that document, and we'll provide the presentation to you as well, so you can get through that link. And then in the schedule of eligible costs, it'll provide the details of whether costs are eligible or not. Generally, there's 5 categories to this. The first one is direct labor. So that pertains to the employee's salary and their corresponding benefits. Second category is the direct materials. So for this project, it would be the software license fees, for example. They're going to have subcontractors and consultants. And something to note is that the work performed by them must be in Canada. And fourth and fifth is your training costs and travel that you will need to complete your project. Next slide. All right. Are there any limits on eligible project costs I should be aware of? Yes, there are. We have 4 limits here. First one are the fringe benefits. They must not exceed 20% of the employees' direct labor costs, so their salaries. Second, we have the total of subcontractors and consulting fees must not exceed 5% of the overall project budget. The total cost of the direct materials, for example, the software license fees, must not exceed 5% of the overall project budget. And last, the total cost of domestic travel must not exceed 3% of the total of all eligible costs. One thing to highlight is domestic travel, so it should be within Canada. Anything else outside of Canada is generally not eligible. Next slide, please. Can I include overhead associated with employees working on my project? No, generally we don't allow claims for overhead costs. This includes, but not just limited to, your office supplies, utilities, rent for the use of the office space or wherever the work is being done out of, or office equipment, and so on. Can I include sales taxes? Yes, you can, but only the non-recoverable portion of the sales tax as defined by the CRA. Next slide. What qualifies as in-kind contributions? So in-kind contributions includes salaries and fringe benefits that are paid at the rate that corresponds to your payroll records. So for example, generally what we'll see here is salary for the university faculty or your principal investigator, so your PI. Anyone not paid a salary would not qualify as in-kind contribution. And is there a minimum for in-kind contribution? The answer is yes. You must have at least 15% of your eligible costs to be in-kind, and that's on a quarterly basis. Next slide. So Canary Funding is claims-based. What does that mean to me? So the way our funding works is it's done retroactively. So at the end of your, well, let me take a step back. The claims are submitted quarterly. So at the end of each quarter, you would submit a claim to us of all your eligible costs that period, and then we will process it on our end and pay you, we'll reimburse you for that eligible cost, less a 10% holdback. So the 10% holdback, these get released and paid at the end of the project, and that's after the financial audit has been completed and all other technical requirements are delivered. Next slide. What supporting documentation is required before the first claim? So before you submit the first claim, what we'll ask you is for proof of salary and fringe benefits for all the employees working on the project. This could come in different forms depending on your institution's payroll. If your payroll is done by a third party, for example, ADP or Ceridian, we would ask for those payroll reports coming from them, and that we can highlight the employee working on that project. Sometimes if the payroll is done out of the, let's say, university itself, we would ask for payroll records from them. That could include the salary letters and so forth. From the benefit side, again, it'll depend on how it's done from your end. If it's from your payroll records, then we would ask for a detailed reconciliation of your fringe benefits. And sometimes we could ask for the, if your benefits is provided by a third party, so let's say Great West Life or Sun Life, we'll ask for their report that highlights the employees' benefit amounts. What supporting documentation is required for each claim? So in addition to the payroll information I spoke about earlier, we would need time records. This would be a record of how many hours the employee had worked, and of those hours, how much was spent on the Canary project. This includes the employees on the project and those that are recorded as in-kind. And another thing we'll need is for it's supplier invoices and employee travel expenses for claims greater than $1,000. Yeah, nothing else to add here. Next slide. Will the project finances be audited? Yes. Audits may be scheduled at any time during a project. All the projects are eligible to be audited and will be audited. We will hire a third-party independent auditor to perform this financial audit. That is the end. Here, I'll pass
So
this.
we have some questions. So one of our questions that we had earlier, it was, we are multi-institutional, but the other institutes are international. Can we count international partner contributions to meet the in-kind requirements for the project?
The answer to that question is no. The work must be done, performed in Canada. We will not accept any work done internationally.
For the purpose of in-kind contributions.
Our next question is, in multi-institutional efforts, how would funds be managed within a project? Is one institution responsible to redistribute to the others, or do funds go directly to all contributing partners, assuming all within Canada?
Thanks, Laura. So in the situation where we have multiple institutions or organizations contributing to a project, Canary would enter into an agreement with one. So the lead contractor is what, how we would refer to that organization here at Canary. And all of the other organizations working on the project where there was either an in-kind contribution or you were looking for to claim eligible costs from that organization would be included in the agreement as a participant. So once the agreement signed between Canary and the lead contractor, we would expect the lead contractor to sign consortium agreements with each of the participants and share those agreements with Canary. At the time that we get down to where the funds flow, it would be Canary would pay all of the funds directly to the lead contractor, and the lead contractor would then coordinate getting the documentation that Canary requires, as well as making payments to those participants.
Thank you, Tracy. Do we have any more questions? There is one French question to which we will be answering via email. Are there any other questions?
So before we end, I'd just like to encourage you, if you have questions as you're preparing your budget or your proposals, your applications, if you have questions for Canary, that you contact us at programs@canary.ca, and we'll be happy to answer them and help you through the process.
I don't see any more questions. Thank you all for attending today's webinar. Have a wonderful day.